Most people think Zach Johnson became famous because he started filming tractors and posting farm videos online. But that is only the surface of the story. The truth is that Zach never set out to become famous at all. For most of his life, he expected to do something much simpler. He thought he would spend his entire life working the same Minnesota farmland his family had worked for generations. Farming was not just his job. It was his family history, his identity, and the future he assumed was already waiting for him. Then one unexpected decision changed everything. Almost overnight, millions of people began watching his life, turning an ordinary farmer into one of YouTube's biggest agricultural success stories. But behind the viral harvest videos, the growing audience, the sponsorships, and the smiling family moments, there was another story developing. A story about family pressure, tragedy, identity, and the strange price of becoming famous while trying to remain a farmer. So what really happened to Zach Johnson? And how did a simple attempt to defend modern farming become something far bigger than anyone could have imagined? Zach Johnson was born into a sixth-generation farming family in Lowry, Minnesota. Farming was never something he had to decide whether he wanted to do. It was simply the world he grew up in. Generations before him had worked the same land, planted crops, operated machinery, and built their lives around agriculture. The expectation was straightforward: keep the family operation alive and continue the work that had already lasted for generations. Long before YouTube existed as part of his life, there was no reason to imagine that cameras, subscribers, sponsorships, and millions of views would ever become part of that future. His path seemed almost predetermined. But then, in April 2016, something started bothering him more and more. Zach was seeing constant criticism of modern agriculture online. People were attacking farmers over genetically modified crops, pesticides, and the way modern farming operated. Farmers were often portrayed as people who did not care about the environment or the consequences of their decisions. But Zach saw a completely different reality. Farmers were living with those consequences themselves. Their children played near the same lakes. Their families drank water from the same wells. The people growing food were also raising their own families on that land. Yet those details rarely became part of the public conversation. Zach could have spent hours arguing with strangers online. Instead, he picked up a phone. That decision would change his life. Rather than trying to win arguments in comment sections, Zach decided to show people what farming actually looked like. His first videos were not complicated productions. There were no expensive cameras, massive crews, dramatic storylines, or professional studio setups. He filmed spring planting, equipment preparation, farm chores, and whatever else happened during a normal day. The camera simply followed what was already happening on the farm. He wanted people to see modern agriculture for themselves instead of relying on assumptions made by people who had never actually been inside a working farm. At first, almost nobody knew where this was going. The audience was small, and there was no reason to believe that millions of people would ever care about watching cornfields, tractors, and harvest equipment. Then something strange happened. One of his earliest viral clips generated a payment of $92. $92 might not sound like much today, but to Zach, it was proof of something important. Someone was actually willing to pay attention to what he was doing. People were curious about farming. They wanted to see what happened behind the scenes. And that tiny payment turned out to be the beginning of something much bigger. Then came the fall of 2017. A video covering harvest preparation suddenly exploded. Within only 3 or 4 days, it reached 100,000 views. Massive combines moving through real fields had captured the attention of people who might never have thought about farming before. For viewers living in cities and suburbs, the videos offered something they almost never experienced firsthand. They were seeing how food was actually produced before it reached a grocery store. And once people started watching, they wanted more. The channel began growing at a speed that surprised everyone. By the end of that harvest season, the subscriber count had climbed from around 7,000 to roughly 30,000. That was already a huge jump, but it was only the beginning. The audience proved that interest in agriculture was not limited to farmers. People who had never operated a tractor and had never walked through a cornfield were becoming regular viewers. Zach originally set a goal of reaching 100,000 subscribers by the end of 2018. At the time, that probably sounded ambitious for a channel centered on farming, machinery, cornfields, and everyday agricultural life. Instead, the goal was completely destroyed. By the end of 2018, the channel had more than 200,000 followers. What had started as a simple attempt to explain farming had become one of the fastest-growing agricultural channels on YouTube. Zach had not planned to become an internet personality. He had not designed some elaborate business strategy to turn himself into a celebrity. He had simply shown people what he was already doing. But as the audience grew, another person became increasingly important to the entire operation. Her name was Becky Johnson. While Zach became the recognizable face of the channel, Becky quietly became the person making much of the business work behind the scenes. And her story is one of the most overlooked parts of the entire journey. Becky had previously worked as a daycare provider. She had no formal background in video editing, social media management, or running a digital media business. But as the channel grew, somebody had to handle all of those responsibilities. Zach was already working exhausting days on the farm. There simply were not enough hours for him to farm, film, manage the business, and edit everything himself. Farm days could begin around 6 in the morning and continue until 11 at night. During planting and harvest, the schedule became even more demanding. There were grain dryers to check overnight, equipment to operate, fields to manage, and countless other responsibilities that could not simply be postponed because a YouTube video needed editing. So Becky stepped in. Every evening, a memory card would come out of the camera and become her responsibility. While the farm continued operating outside, Becky would sit inside reviewing footage. She learned how to edit. She created thumbnails. She wrote descriptions. She uploaded videos. She handled social media. She managed finances and sponsorships. And she taught herself more advanced editing techniques through online tutorials. What began as helping her husband had quietly turned into a full-time business role. And she was doing all of it while family life continued. The Johnson household included 4 children, 3 biological children and a niece who had been adopted into the family. School schedules, meals, appointments, homework, parenting, and ordinary family responsibilities did not disappear just because the channel was becoming successful. Somehow, Becky and Zach had to make all of those pieces fit together. Then, by 2019, the financial side of the story became almost unbelievable. During a conversation between Zach and Becky, they revealed that the YouTube channel alone had generated roughly 5 times more income than their actual farming operation. Think about what that meant. The Johnson family had spent generations building a livelihood around that land. Their ancestors had worked the same soil for well over a century. Yet now, a camera pointed at those fields was producing more money than the farming operation itself. The thing that had started as a way to explain agriculture had become an entirely different business. Industry estimates placed YouTube advertising revenue at roughly $290,000 a year. Sponsorships reportedly added another major stream of income, with branded posts bringing in somewhere between $5,000 and $15,000 each. Partnerships included companies connected to farming, tractors, and agricultural products. Then there was merchandise. More than 2,000 pieces were reportedly sold during the first 6 days after merchandise launched. And the business expanded beyond YouTube videos. A farming podcast began attracting between 50,000 and 70,000 downloads per episode. Suddenly, what had started with a phone camera was becoming a diversified media operation. But even with all that financial success, money was not the event that changed Zach's story the most. Something much darker was coming. In December 2019, tragedy struck a nearby farming community. 3 family members, including an 11-year-old boy, lost their lives after being overcome by fumes while working inside a harvest storage silo only about 20 miles away. For people outside agriculture, an accident like this can be difficult to understand. But for farming communities, grain bins and storage facilities are known hazards. Conditions can change incredibly quickly, and when something goes wrong, the people trying to help can also be placed in serious danger. Local volunteer firefighters attempted a rescue, but they did not have the specialized equipment required to safely handle the situation. The loss affected far more than one family. It shook neighbors, emergency responders, and farmers throughout the region. Minnesota and North Dakota were among the states experiencing particularly serious grain bin-related fatalities, while rural volunteer departments often faced emergencies without the equipment, funding, or specialized training necessary to respond. For Zach, the tragedy made an old problem impossible to ignore. If something positive could come from such a terrible loss, Perhaps it could be helping prevent another family from experiencing the same thing. That idea eventually led to the creation of Harvest Outreach, a nonprofit focused on grain bin safety education and equipment funding. Instead of simply talking about the problem, the organization tried to provide practical resources that rural fire departments could actually use. And Zach had something many agricultural safety organizations did not have: a massive audience. Through videos and live streams, the message could reach hundreds of thousands of people. A fundraising campaign was launched to help volunteer fire departments obtain specialized rescue equipment and safety training. The response was far larger than expected. More than $110,000 was raised. The money supported equipment and training for roughly 60 to 70 rural fire departments spread across 13 states. And then something happened that proved the effort was more than just a fundraising campaign. Equipment purchased through those donations later helped save a real person's life during an emergency in Illinois. That meant the tragedy that had shocked a farming community had helped create something capable of protecting other communities far beyond Minnesota. But while Zach was using his platform to help others, another struggle was quietly developing inside his own life. The bigger the channel became, the harder it was to remain simply a farmer. For generations, farming had been the Johnson family's identity. Their ancestors had worked the same soil going back to the 1870s. The entire family legacy had been built around planting, growing, and harvesting crops. Now Zach's life was changing. There were sponsorship calls, meetings, travel, filming schedules, business decisions, content planning, social media responsibilities. The channel needed more attention every year. And that created an uncomfortable question. What happens when documenting your farm begins taking time away from actually farming? The answer was not simple. Zach's father continued operating the roughly 2,400-acre farm full-time. He often took on additional responsibilities whenever Zach's media commitments pulled him away from fieldwork. That support made it possible for the two worlds to continue existing side by side. But the tension was still there. The farming business represented generations of history. The media business represented a completely unexpected future. And unlike farmland or machinery, online success could disappear almost overnight. An algorithm could change. Views could fall. Advertising could decline. Sponsorships could disappear. A platform could suddenly change the rules. The family had built something incredibly successful, but it was built in a world where nothing was guaranteed. That made the decision even more complicated. Should Zach spend more time protecting the family farming tradition? Or should he continue building the digital business that had already become larger than anyone expected? For the moment, he tried to do both. And while that private identity struggle continued, the public reach of the channel kept growing. Eventually, the channel passed 1 million subscribers and hundreds of millions of lifetime views. Millennial Farmer became one of the most watched farming channels on YouTube. But perhaps the most surprising part was who was actually watching. A huge portion of the audience was not made up of farmers. Roughly half of the viewers were reportedly people with no direct connection to agriculture at all. Urban and suburban viewers were watching because they were curious. They wanted to understand where their food came from. Many had never sat inside a tractor, walked through a cornfield, or watched a harvest happen up close. For them, Zach's videos became a window into a world they normally never saw. That changed the purpose of the channel. It was no longer simply one farmer talking to other farmers. It had become a bridge between agriculture and the general public. Every planting season showed another part of the process. Every equipment repair revealed another challenge. Every weather problem demonstrated how much uncertainty goes into producing food. Every harvest video showed the enormous amount of work that happens long before a product appears on a supermarket shelf. And Zach's original mission remained surprisingly consistent. He wanted to become a national voice for agriculture, provide farmer-to-farmer education, and create a real conversation between farmers and people who knew little about farming. Instead of using complicated technical language, he explained topics like GMOs, pesticides, precision agriculture, and modern farm management in a simple way. Rather than constantly fighting critics, he showed people what modern farming actually looked like and allowed them to form their own conclusions. That approach became one of the biggest reasons the channel felt different. Clean water, for example, was not presented as an issue that mattered only to consumers. It mattered to farmers too. Farmers raised their children on that land. They drank from the same groundwater. They depended on healthy soil for future harvests. Those realities rarely became part of the national conversation. But on Zach's channel, they became part of the story. There was also something else that viewers noticed. The videos felt real. They were not perfectly polished productions where every problem disappeared during editing. Equipment broke. Weather ruined plans. Planting got delayed. Harvest nights became exhausting. Things went wrong. And viewers stayed. They were not just watching tractors. They were becoming attached to the people operating them. That connection opened the door to even bigger projects. In 2019, the podcast Off the Husk launched with support from a major agricultural sponsor. Episodes regularly attracted 50,000 to 70,000 downloads, allowing longer conversations about agriculture, technology, business, and everyday farm life. Then family content became another major part of the audience's connection to the Johnsons. One video featuring a 10-year-old learning to operate farm equipment eventually became one of the channel's most popular uploads, reaching more than 4 million views. That told Zach something important. People were not only interested in machines. They were interested in watching a family legacy being passed to the next generation. In December 2020, another channel launched, focusing on family moments and dirt track racing, a hobby separate from the main farming content. It gave viewers a look at another side of the Johnson family and showed that their lives were about more than planting and harvesting. Recognition followed. A Minnesota Agricultural Foundation eventually honored the work with a media award, recognizing the transparency and positive advocacy built through years of content. Then the platform's influence expanded into direct community work. Farm rescue volunteer work began in 2022, helping farmers facing real emergencies while also using the same audience that had originally made Zach famous. A scholarship partnership eventually developed too, creating college opportunities for students pursuing agriculture-related degrees. Think about how strange that journey was. It started because Zach was frustrated with people criticizing farmers online. He picked up a camera to explain his side. That camera generated $92. Then it generated millions of views. Then those views created a business. Then the business helped raise money for rural fire departments. Then the audience helped support farmers and future agricultural students. Something that began as a response to online criticism had become a platform capable of creating real opportunities for the next generation. And yet, many versions of Zach Johnson's story stop there. They talk about the channel's growth. They mention the scholarship. They talk about the awards. But what happened years later? That is where the story becomes even more interesting. In September 2024, a major agricultural publication selected Zach Johnson for a special honor recognizing people making a meaningful difference across the industry. The recognition was timed around National Farm Safety Week. Around the same period, Zach turned 40 years old. By then, he had spent roughly 8 years consistently creating content built around a simple principle: show people the truth of farm life rather than trying to make agriculture look perfect. Then came another major milestone. By August 2025, the channel had passed 1.2 million subscribers. Zach was invited to moderate a panel at a major Minnesota farming event focused on the future of agriculture. The conversations there touched on something deeply personal: the pride and pressure involved in potentially raising a 7th generation of farmers on that same land. Because despite everything that had happened online, the family legacy had never completely disappeared. The cameras had changed Zach's life. The internet had changed the family's business. But the land was still there. The same soil. The same agricultural history. The same question about whether the next generation would continue what the previous generations had started. Then, in May 2026, another milestone arrived. The channel officially crossed 10 full years online. 10 years. Think about where Zach had started. A farmer frustrated by online criticism. A phone camera. A few ordinary farm videos. And one strange $92 payment. 10 years later, the project had become a massive agricultural media platform with more than 1 million subscribers, hundreds of millions of views, podcasts, sponsorships, merchandise, community projects, safety campaigns, scholarships, and an audience that stretched far beyond farming. But perhaps the most important part of Zach Johnson's story is not the number of subscribers. It is what happened because people were willing to watch. People who had never seen a working farm were suddenly learning where their food came from. Farmers who needed specialized rescue equipment received support. Students interested in agriculture gained opportunities. Families saw their own struggles reflected in someone else's videos. And all of it came from a decision that seemed almost insignificant at the time. Instead of arguing with strangers on the internet, Zach showed them his farm. That simple choice created something nobody could have predicted. The farmer became a storyteller. The storyteller became a business owner. The business became a platform. And the platform became a way to connect people who normally lived in completely different worlds. For Zach Johnson, the journey was never really about becoming famous. It was about showing people a life they rarely got to see. And maybe that is exactly why it worked. Because the videos were never pretending to be something they were not. They showed the machinery, but they also showed the problems. They showed the harvest, but they also showed the long nights. They showed success, but they did not hide failure. And behind all of it was a family trying to balance a centuries-old tradition with a completely new kind of future. From $92 to more than 10 years online, Zach Johnson's story is a reminder that sometimes the biggest changes begin with the smallest decisions. One phone, one farm, one frustrated farmer, and one decision to stop arguing and start showing people the truth. What began as an attempt to explain modern farming became something far bigger than a YouTube channel. It became a bridge between farmers and consumers, a source of support for rural communities, and a platform capable of helping shape the future of agriculture. And after everything Zach has built, perhaps the biggest question is no longer how famous he became. It is what the next generation will do with everything he started.